Welcome to The Deepening, a podcast that explores the inner journey and its relationship to our outer life through the lens of Jungian psychology, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Suzanne Larue. Let's journey inward together. In this episode, I speak with Valerie Mason-John, also known as Vimalasara. She is a public speaker and teacher in the fields of conflict transformation, leadership, and mindfulness, and the author of 8 books. We speak about her book, 8-Step Recovery, Using the Buddha's Teachings to Overcome Addiction, which she co-authored with psychiatrist Dr. Paramabandhu Groves. The book offers a compassionate and inclusive approach to recovery that speaks not just to those struggling with substances, but to anyone navigating patterns of avoidance and suffering. Our time together was a bit shorter than planned due to unforeseen circumstances, but what unfolded was a rich and insightful conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it. Hello, Vimalasara. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure, thank you.
I'd love to start by asking what inspired you to write this book? What called you to offer this particular path?
Yeah, and thank you for taking me back. In fact, what happened was my publisher wrote to me and asked me if I had another book. And I had written Detox Your Heart, Meditations for Emotional Trauma. And when they had asked me, I was teaching a Buddhist teaching, the 4 reminders. And one of the reminders is this precious birth. And so we had a week of reflecting on it. And during that reflection, the voice that came up said, what you have to offer is your recovery. And I remember thinking, I was a lot younger then. Oh, that's not going to make me famous, blah, 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 whatever. And I always remember my mime and physical theatre teacher. And he always said, if something comes up and you turn away from it, it's always good to turn towards it because that's where the gold is. And at some point I turned towards it. And then I just thought, let me write a book around not specifically my recovery, but sharing my recovery through the lens of the Buddhist teachings, because that's where I got my recovery, in the rooms of meditation.
First of all, that is such a beautiful teaching from your theater instructor. I love that idea of turning towards. If we're feeling inclined to turn away, that's usually a sign maybe that it's something that we actually need to turn towards. Beautiful. One of the things that really stood out to me immediately about the book is how you define addiction, not just in terms of substances or behaviors, but as a deeply human pattern that we all struggle with. And you write that this book is for anyone struggling with addiction or compulsion, but also for those who might not think of themselves as addicted, but have habits that are causing suffering. Why was it important to expand the definition that way?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, to me, that is the definition rather than thinking, expanding the definition. It's human to have habits. And of course, it's all on a spectrum. For some people, it's a matter of life and death. For some people, it's a functional way. And some people manage to keep it at bay. However, the Buddha, in his first discourse, actually says part of the human malady is that there is addiction to hedonism and there is addiction to self-mortification, and what we need is a middle way. And we can see that there are people who are really addicted to beating themselves up and that real nihilistic tendency, and there are those of us like me more into that hedonistic side. And where do these habits come from? I think, again, as we started, turning away from discomfort, that's where these habitual behaviors come from, because we learn to turn away because why would we want to suffer? Why would we want to feel pain? Especially if we can turn away and soothe ourselves and make us feel better.
Yeah, Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And so much of what you offer in this book is about turning toward those difficult places and facing what we usually try to push away. That's what really stood out to me about this book, not just that it addresses addiction, but that it speaks to this deeply human impulse we all have to turn away from discomfort. You're using the Buddhist teachings, which are for everyone, and one of the things I really appreciate is how you make them feel so accessible. You offer practical, thoughtful tools that create a welcoming entry point, even for people who've never done this kind of inner work before.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think that was really important for both myself and Dr. Paramabandhu Groves. It's to say, Paramabandhu he's retired now, but was a senior psychiatrist for the National Health System in the UK, specifically working with alcohol and other addictions. And I think it was a beautiful marriage of the two of us coming together, because I had the lived experience of addiction and was working in that field of conflict transformation. And I just really wanted to come back to this thing of making accessible and expanding the definition, or opening up the definition of addiction. Paramabandhu and I, it was a beautiful piece of work together. We're both in the same Buddhist lineage. However, we said that we must agree with everything. And if we didn't agree on something, it couldn't go into the book.
Mm.
So, because we both had to put our names to it. And so there was only one point when we came to this place of, do we agree or disagree? And it was me saying stinking thinking was
Mm.
addiction. And he said to me, I, how can I how can I stand by that? My colleagues will think I'm ridiculous, if we say that stinking thinking is an addiction. And I remember looking at him and saying, stinking thinking is the result of road rage. It's a result of people taking their lives. It's a result of many things. And he conceded and said, I get it.
Hmm. Yeah, I really like that you included thinking because the ways we get stuck in loops and self judgment really can be addictive and it does become its own kind of suffering. And I appreciated how the book frames addiction more broadly, not just about substances, but about the habitual ways we try to avoid pain. Would you say patterns like people pleasing and control fall into that as well?
Yeah, coming back to this thing of thinking, Suzanne, what was so clear to me was when I had let go of my gross addictions, I can remember waking up in my bed and thinking, oh my God, my biggest addiction is my stinking thinking. And again, I think, like, if we, in terms of expanding the definition of addiction, I like to expand it in this way, that actually there are behaviors, habitual behaviors, which have protected us. And so coming to people pleasing, fawning, that is a behavior which people have developed to protect themselves. And so it can be really habitual. And I don't want to demonize these behaviors, but what I would say is that they're limited. So, in a way, whether it's people pleasing or turning to rage, what we're really looking at is the habitual behavior of turning away from difficult experience. And that's what we have as humans. We have this tendency of turning away, which again, if we look at the Buddhist teachings, the Four Noble Truths, the first truth is very clear that there will be suffering, not that life is suffering. However, because we will age, and we know so many people want to look young, will turn away from being sick. At the moment, I've got this broken rib and I don't want it. My turning away, I want to recover quickly. They said it's going to take 6 weeks, and it's like I'm into the fourth week and things don't seem to be getting better. And do I turn to things to soothe myself? So in a way, the addiction for me is this habitual way of turning away from difficult circumstances. I always say that actually it's like a child. I used to work a lot with young people and we would give them time out. Okay, time out. But the child always came back again. And this is, it's okay to take time out, but to remember you have to come back to it.
Mhm.
Problem is, we want to take time out and never come back to it. Yeah.
Right. You write in the book the tragedy of addiction is that people turn to a substance or a distraction to attain freedom from suffering, but end up in a vicious cycle of creating more suffering and craving.
Yes, this is definitely, if people are familiar with the Buddhist teachings, this is really the second arrow teaching, or the second dart teaching, that pain is inevitable, mental pain is inevitable, physical pain is inevitable, period. So mental pain, physical pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. So this is, and what's the suffering? It's like, it shouldn't be me, it's not fair, this shouldn't be happening, and so we multiply our suffering. A Buddhist teacher, Shinzen Young, has said that P times R equals S. So pain times resistance equals suffering.
What you said about the two arrows of suffering reminded me of a teaching from someone I've worked with, Jennifer Wellwood, who talks about it as the simple human experience. And I really love this framing, just staying with the simple human experience, which may be grief, loss, fear, anger, whatever's arising. and that what we do is we add on to that simple human experience with unnecessary elaboration, and that's what really causes all of our suffering. But this idea of coming back home to the simple human experience.
I love that you use the term coming home to this simple human experience, because in my latest book, First Aid Kit for the Mind, Breaking the Cycle of Habitual Behaviors, I talk about coming home to the body and how important it is to come home to the body. Yeah. So again, often we can turn to the alcohol, we can turn to the sexual behaviors or to food. I mean, even myself, I can still see with transitions, working with transitions. I've been traveling, I come back home, what's the first thing that I want to do? It's put something in my mouth, and I have to pause and think, hold on, what's happening now? The person who's a cigarette smoker will definitely pick up the cigarette and start smoking. So there are these habitual things that we do to try and soothe transitions, and transitions are a big part of life. And then again, I think we have to think of the young person who was so shy, so awkward, and they go to their first party and they're handed a cigarette, or they're handed a beer or a glass of wine, or they're handed a spliff, and all of a sudden the world becomes rosy, and all of a sudden people are listening to them, and all of a sudden they're cracking these jokes and people are laughing at them. And that, it's like, wow, they have found the medicine to actually soothe this awkwardness, to soothe this embarrassment. They found the medicine, and so they get onto this cycle of addiction, and then of course it becomes this vicious cycle.
Yeah, that's something that I know from personal experience. And it's been interesting because my son has been talking openly about his depression recently. And that's gotten my brother and me talking about how we felt a lot of the same kinds of things when we were younger, the self doubt and the social anxiety. But we just covered it up with drugs and alcohol. And so it's been interesting to reflect on that. And, now he's in recovery and, we're doing our work in our own ways.
For a couple of things which resonates for me or comes up for me as I listen to you is first thing of how important it is for the family to come into recovery, and not just one person. So it's just really beautiful to hear your sibling, your brother, and your son working on that. And secondly, I want to say that actually so often people hold on to the alcohol because if they let go of the alcohol, they would have to come into relationship with the depression.
Yeah.
So, again, courage to actually work with that. And then also, I just think something like depression, we have to remember that actually it can be a chemical thing. It's just, yeah, what causes depression? What are the aspects of depression? And that can look so different for so many people. I mean, I would never have said that I experienced depression, but actually being uh, a, a chronic disordered eating, it's a form of depression. I mean, when I think about it, I think, oh my God, of course, this was depression. But as you say, depression is so much part of the human experience. And I just even, anxiety, there's so much. I mean, you're in the US, okay? At the moment, there's so much anxiety, so much fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've found interesting to realize in my own journey, as well as in working with clients over and over again, is how, and I know you've already pointed to this, but this thing about how what we avoid and think will be so hard is made so much harder. Like when you were talking about we have depression, so we try to cover it over with alcohol and other kinds of addictions, and yet that only makes it worse. And it's so interesting how we think that that seems so bad, while meanwhile we are inflicting something on ourselves that is so much worse.
I mean, it's that great aphorism: before enlightenment is chopping the wood and hauling the water, and after enlightenment is chopping the wood and hauling the water. And I really love that because, when we are able to free ourselves from these addictive behaviors, it's not like the same stuff isn't happening. The same stuff is happening. However, we get to relate to it differently. and it becomes so much more easier. And I know for myself, I just would not want to go back to that realm or hell realm of addictive behaviors. Life is so much easier without having certain behaviors in my life.
I know you said earlier that you don't really see it as necessarily expanding the definition of addiction, that this is what you think addiction is. But clearly in our culture, the way people think about addiction is typically substance or maybe sex and gambling, but that's about the extent of it. And so I do just want to note that I think that this more expansive definition is so important because I think, so many of us can go along with our habitual patterns and we can say, well, I'm not an addict. And then that can become the excuse for why we don't make a change in our lives.
I think the reason why I say that is, we either go with the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, or I go with the definition of Buddhism of mindfulness. So, with the definition of Buddhism, it's that is what addiction is. So that's why I say I don't expand it. But however, most psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists go with the definition of the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. And I think in a way it is really important, if we do have psychiatrists, psychotherapists listening, is not to limit or not to restrict that definition, and to really open up the aperture. Because again, sometimes people say, how can bulimia be an addiction? I tell you how it can be addiction. There was once upon a time when I could not walk past a bakery without not going in it. So being addicted to the food. And then I was addicted to the binges, because going on a binge, and one day I really do need to write about this, but actually, altered states, when you're on a binge, you're just in a completely different realm. It's only you and the food. It's just like the person who takes the heroin or the fentanyl. You don't think about anything else.
Well, let's talk about the early steps in your 8 step model. We've been talking about it really and circling around suffering and meeting and turning towards it. So, the first 3 steps really struck me because they invite us to meet our suffering, not with judgment, but with acceptance, friendliness, and curiosity. Why is that approach so powerful?
Well, I'd say that this approach is so powerful because the first 3 steps really mirror the first 3 of the Noble Truths, which is one of the core Buddhist teachings. The first truth, that there is suffering. And for me, this was when I came across this truth. I was like, oh my God, so there's suffering. So there's nothing wrong with me, because I really thought there was something wrong with me. Like it was all about me. In that addiction, we can get quite narcissistic. And it was like, why am I suffering? What's wrong with me? And actually realizing that actually suffering is normal. I mean, it was almost like my life changed overnight, that actually that I wasn't the only person suffering. And I think this is really important, that it is part of the human condition. And then, the second one, seeing how we create extra suffering in our lives, and in the second noble truth, it's talk about craving and clinging. And I could really see how I could create this extra suffering in my life around my craving and clinging. So for me, it was just so accessible. And then there's an end of suffering. And then the fourth one, there's a path that leads you away from suffering. We say in the book, recognizing impermanence shows us that our suffering can end. It gave me possibility. It gave me more than hope. It gave me possibility. Just clearly saying that there is an end to suffering. And I really do believe that. And again, when we're talking about there's an end to suffering, we're talking about there's an end of that second dart of suffering. Yeah. And that's what gives us freedom.
I wanted to say that your perspective on impermanence really kind of jogged something new in me because I had always thought of impermanence in the spiritual context as being the cause of suffering. The fact that we want to keep things, fixed and that we don't want them to change. And so impermanence is the cause of suffering. But what I also loved about the way that you present it is that it's also the key that shows us that suffering can end.
Mm.
Because if everything changes, that this can change as well, that we can change.
Yeah, I mean, just say to him, just imagine if we were stuck at the age of 5 or stuck at the age of 15. I mean, impermanence is a beautiful thing.
In my own work, I really emphasize turning toward our pain and meeting it somatically. I help people feel into what's arising in the body and make space for it, befriending it. And I'd love to hear how you see the role of the body in recovery. You mentioned its importance earlier. What helps someone stay with discomfort in the body? What does it look like to meet it there, and what helps someone stay with it?
Yeah, the reality is that if we think of the addictive malady, it's all about getting high, getting out of our body. And so, in a way, we're disembodied. And really, I mean, for me, it's the breath. Can the breath bring us home to the body? So, when we're disembodied, it's like all sense doors have been closed. It's like the house, all doors are shut, keep everybody out. And yet, somehow the healing is in the feeling and turning towards the body. And we have to do this really gently, because for some people it can be absolutely terrifying going back to the body, because that was an unsafe space, because that body had been violated in particular ways, which is why often we leave the body. We have to learn how to be in the body and be safe in the body. So recovery cannot just be a cognitive process, because the body has memories. When we get activated, often these memories come up. So in a way, the reason why we want to come back to the body is so that we can release what the body is holding. That's part of the recovery, to be able to release. Because if we don't release what the body is holding, when we get activated, that's when, we can turn to these addictive, compulsive behaviors.
I think that is so important, because also what we're feeling in our body is usually the first indication of something that we're needing or that's going on. And so if we're cut off from it, then we don't have access to our own inner wisdom.
I thank you for saying that, because it's just sparked off the one of the most liberating teachings, I think, in the Buddhist canon or the mindfulness canon, is the whole thing around feeling, that actually we have these sense doors and there will be contact. So it's like somebody who's trying to stop drinking alcohol, they go to a restaurant and their eye has contact with the alcohol and sensations will arise. And often what can happen is, if we resist it, it can be so unpleasant. And so the person wants to turn away from it. And then it's like, oh, there's a sign, nobody believes in me. Lo and behold, the person's talked themselves into picking up the drink, because they start listening to the thoughts. It's easier to be with the thoughts, because that's so much more familiar than to be with the unpleasantness in the body. And so it really is important, because often people aren't aware of that point of contact when sensation has arisen, and this happens so quickly. And so even for myself now, there were things, it's like, oh, I'm feeling okay, there was contact, feeling unpleasant in the body, let me take a pause so I can take care of myself.
When you mentioned that for some people, they have to take it slowly going into the body, I was reminded of an exercise in one of Tara Brach's books where she described it as dipping the toe in. And it's always stayed with me when I'm working with people to just remember it's okay to just dip your toe in and come back and just slowly make friends. We don't need to dive all the way in. And in fact, oftentimes it's not advisable to do that.
Yeah, because it could be a bit of a car crash.
Exactly. That reminder to go slowly really speaks to something that runs through this whole path that we haven't even talked about yet. Loving kindness is such an essential part of the 8-step recovery model and of Buddhist practice more broadly. As you encourage people to turn toward their pain, you also invite them to do so with gentleness and compassion. And there are so many practices in the book that support that. Before we close, would you be willing to share one of your favorite loving kindness practices from the book?
The practice of the metabhavana, loving kindness, I just found so powerful. However, it was also very challenging to give loving kindness towards myself. And so, which is why I developed the practice of the 4 basic needs of the heart, to unpack that first stage.
I really love that practice where you break down the first stage of metta or loving kindness into 4 embodied steps: attention, affection, appreciation, and acceptance. Will you lead us in that now?
So, yeah, it's just attention, paying attention to this body, paying attention to feeling in the body, just paying attention to the body and to thoughts. Affection, really placing a hand upon the body, anywhere upon the body, and feeling the warmth of your own hand, giving yourself affection. And breathe. Appreciation, really notice your own hand appreciating you, sitting with appreciation. And acceptance, accepting who we are in this moment now. So letting go of the past, letting go of the future, and just really being in the now, now, now. Acceptance is in the now, now, now. Attention, affection, appreciation, acceptance is in the now.
Beautiful. Thank you. As we begin to close, I want to invite you to share what you're working on now, or if there's anything you'd like us to know about upcoming in your work.
Yeah, what does it say? I had a new book come out late last year called A First Aid Kit for the Mind, Breaking the Cycle of Habitual Behaviors. And what I love about this book is a pocket book, and you could use it like a pack of cards and open it up on a page. And and then there can be a nugget of wisdom there, and there are images as well, because if you're like me, I have a stack of books which I'm going to read, and when am I going to get through this? And whereas in this book there's a 1 minute practice, or there's a 5 minute practice, or if you want a longer teaching you can have that. So yeah, and then I am co-leading a day retreat at Spirit Rock with Kevin Griffin on August the 15th. I think that's a Friday. And I would say you can look at my website. I need to update my website. But what I would actually say I'm really working on my own process. I think, so often us as Dharma teachers or as healers, I have a private practice too, but you can forget yourself. So I'm actually really using this time to do more of my work and really working more on just my behaviors around food. So I see a therapist twice a week at the moment, which is great to really work on my transformation. And then I've just finished a course on neurosomatic intelligence. So I'm really now combining that in my private practice and in on my retreats, and really kind of beginning to define myself as a Dharma healer, just trained in pranayama breathing. And because for me, it's about sharing these teachings out there. It's to help people heal and to help people have freedom. That's
Yeah.
for me what it's about, opening the door and shepherding people to have more freedom.
Yeah, and as we deepen in our own practices and in our own growth path and unfold deeper and deeper layers of our own journey, it makes us better and better vehicles for supporting others in that. And you are such a clear, compassionate, and wonderful teacher. And it's just been such an honor to have you here. Your work is deeply transformative, and it's really been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for reflecting that back. And I would say it's an honor to be a mirror, because what you see in me is what you have in yourself. So it's an honor to be a mirror. And thank you for inviting me.
I'm so grateful to Vimalasara for being here and for sharing her clarity, compassion, and presence. As you heard, our time together was shorter than planned, but even in that brief window, so much was illuminated. Vimalasara shared how Buddhist teachings offer not just a philosophy, but a lived path, one that invites us to meet suffering with curiosity and kindness, to return to the body, and to understand that healing doesn't mean getting rid of pain, but relating to it differently. One key theme that runs through both Buddhist recovery and the 12-step tradition that we didn't have time to explore is the role of service. Service in this context isn't just about helping, it's about remembering we're not alone, that healing happens in relationship, and that we each have something meaningful to offer, even as we continue doing our own work. There's so much more in 8-step recovery than we could touch on today, like the deep link between recovery and awakening. But I hope this conversation offered a glimpse of the wisdom and possibility that this work holds. If you're in recovery, if you're supporting someone who is, or even if you're simply noticing the ways you turn away from yourself, this book is a powerful companion. I hope that these teachings and practices will support you in turning toward yourself and in finding peace and freedom. This has been The Deepening with Suzanne Larue. If you enjoy conversations that lead you deeper into self and soul, I invite you to subscribe, follow, and tune in for future episodes. Thanks for joining us.